So let us continue carrying that interfaith spirit with us now as we engage in a panel discussion on the topic, Empowering Youth for Positive Social Change. How can multi-faith literacy programs in our schools and universities help? And our moderator is Dr. Hasan Raza, and he will introduce the panelists. Oh, Robin, it's a different. Okay, wonderful. So welcome, Doctor.
May I take this opportunity to pause for station identification after the due reflection on prayers and the prayer for peace and love, especially loving kindness, from all religious traditions. The major sublime virtue was love. All sublime virtues have their origin in love. We have a panel discussion coming up with 3 speakers who are eminently qualified with expertise and experience on the topic. Empowering youth for positive change, social change. How can multi-faith literacy programs in our schools and universities help? We have 3 speakers, and I'm your moderator. Before I moderate, I'll say before, it's been a long day since 8 o'clock. I sing you a song. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when stars are gray. You never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. Nobody can take your sunshine away. God is your sunshine. So I ask you now, as we move towards the second part, that you bask under the sunshine of salubrity. Salubrity means good health. The panel discussion, a little later, I plan to give great thanks to our convener, Robin Arthur, for initiating everything here. I pause for that a little later in the second day. But this topic is particularly intriguing from my perspective as an educator for several years in the States, in UK, and at Dalhousie, totaling over 35 years. Modern youth is drifting without high values, ideals, and vision. There's high alienation. We heard the word this morning, remember? High alienation in our youth that are experiencing a disconnect from cultural roots, from family, from nature, from God, from conscience, a loss of meaning in life, a moral compass, authentic identity. The university's student presidents are labeling them as customers rather than students. Just like mental health is calling them mental health consumers. I consume, therefore I am. Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. And Jesus said, I love, therefore I am. So they have to resist this. In addition to that, the students are anchored so much to a culture of materialism, manipulated by the media, advertising rock stars, sports icons, the loss of leadership vision, the vision of the true self, and the triggers of empowerment. What are the conventional triggers of empowerment? Youth empowerment, political power, information, status, influence, authority, digital literacy, without moral literacy, and without an ethical vision. So now, we take the opportunity to have one of our speakers from St. Mary's, Dr. Hussain, who has been around actively in Halifax. He's relatively new, and who has been talking on Islam and various subjects, and coming to a new concept, which he will explain to us too. We have heard of digital literacy, computer literacy, ethical literacy, but he's taking us on a beautiful journey to multi-faith literacy. So we'll ask him later the ABC of that. So it takes me great pleasure to call on Professor Hussain to take the panel. I thought the panel will be sitting here, where three of them will be sitting and you will be asking questions. But apparently we don't have that arrangement. It doesn't matter. What matters is the wisdom coming and the viewpoints coming, knowledge, expertise, and experience making music this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Allow me to begin by saying, as a formerly colonized person who's now participating in a colonial project, my respect to Elder Billy and the unceded land that I'm standing on now. And the topic that Robin proposed for me to comment on was multi-faith literacy, and I proposed the idea of the talk from moving from tolerance to an ethic of difference and complexity. So let me begin by saying Canada seems a pretty good place to be a Muslim, at least lately, right? I mean this sincerely and not just as self-congratulation. As a Muslim in Canada, I am not afraid for my safety, and the racism and xenophobia which I've encountered here tends to be of a lower magnitude than the ones that I've faced in Europe or the United States, especially in this particular election year. If I was feeling generous, I could even argue that the Liberal victory in the last federal election was a rejection of fear-mongering Islamophobic vitriol that's bubbling in your America. Academics tend to agree that Muslims, according at least to Abdul Muhammad Kazmepur, who he argues that have integrated easily into public institutions, including in media outlets. You see Muslim names as newscasters, weather persons, in addition. But they are struggling with economic and social integration in Canada. Still, it behooves us to be cautious with our praise, as a general trends may be cold comfort to members, for example, of the Kautra Muslim Religious Association that were victims of a devastating hate attack in the form of arson just last year. Their mosque was burned down in Peterborough. Some fear that the current refugee crisis threatens to shatter our fragile multicultural democracy, and that refugees may represent a threat to Canadian values and possibly even lives. One strategy to resist this kind of fear-mongering is through education, particularly multi-faith literacy as an extension of multiculturalism. Vanguard venues for these conversations are our educational institutions, which can help students cultivate critical minds that move beyond mere tolerance of the other to embracing an ethic of difference and complexity. In this paper, I intend to share some anecdotes from my experiences teaching religious studies courses at St. Mary's University, and also the responsibility of teaching for the purpose of empowerment, because it's not the same as teaching generally, and also a way to cultivate an appreciation of religion itself as a critical category. Sorry. Many of my millennial students are worried about the state of the world. Their fears of environmental collapse, joblessness, dangerous brown bodies, and so-called religious extremism are exacerbated by an unrestricted access to information which they lack the tools to process. The 24 hours news cycle and social media make it difficult to cultivate critical distance, as we often find ourselves drowning in a sea of constant crisis. The question that was posed by Robin Arthur when he asked me to speak was, how does multi-faith literacy programs, or how do multi-faith literacy programs in our schools help our students become empowered for positive social change? Let me begin by unpacking some of the ways that I understood the question before turning ultimately to some strategies we could deploy. I understand multi-faith literacy to be a subcomponent of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is understood to be a central feature of Canadian identity, and it is defined on the Government of Canada website, and this is one of the first hits you'll get if you're looking at the government website, especially from an immigration perspective. The multiculturalism angle kind of hits you in the face. And it says on that site that Canadian multiculturalism is fundamental to our belief that all citizens are equal. Multiculturalism ensures that citizens can keep their identities, can take pride in their ancestry, and have a sense of belonging. Acceptance gives Canadians a feeling of security and self-confidence, making them more open and more accepting of diverse cultures. The Canadian experience has shown that multiculturalism encourages racial and ethnic harmony and cross-cultural understanding. Through multiculturalism, Canada recognizes the potential of all Canadians, encouraging them to integrate into their society and take an active part in its social, cultural, economic, and political affairs. Multiculturalism, thus explained, as on the website, is a tool for harmony premised on the understanding that celebrating difference and encouraging distinctiveness allows for better integration. Explicitly framed as something different from the American melting pot analogy or approach in which distinctiveness is absorbed and transformed maybe or maybe not through a very hot pot. So the dangers critics have warned us of multiculturalism is the ghettoization of minorities or an uneven distribution of burdens on women and sexual others. The question is, how do we balance politically liberal commitments while respecting cultural and religious difference? One strategy might be through cultivating multi-faith literacy, which requires a shift from merely tolerating religious difference to learning about the internal diversity and complexity of individual traditions. But multi-faith literacy is more than merely learning the facts about other traditions. It's also attempting to engage with those traditions on their own terms. This logically requires that multi-faith literacy begins with the suspension of the primacy of one's own truth claims. Modeled, for example, at Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church realized that the importance of conceding salvation outside of the Church. Formerly, it was only salvation within the Church, but after Vatican II, they contemplated that other people could also get into heaven. If we evaluate other traditions in terms of the subjective or personal experiences of our own, we rely on what linguists would call false friends. In language classes, we often have to teach students that the words that look or sound similar in one language might have a very different meaning in another. For example, if you claimed that Mary was embarazada, it may sound like she was embarrassed, but when in reality, that's the Spanish word for pregnant, right? Similarly, concepts like the soul, God, and prophet, even what constitutes Scripture itself, may differ vastly across and even within traditions. The first step of multi-faith literacy, or of any comparative religion course at St. Mary's University, begins with a decentering of the self, and an internalization of the Latin maxim de omnibus dubnatum, or doubt everything, and including, in this case, doubt your teacher. I could be lying to you, right? Is what I tell my students at the beginning. I hope that they challenge me in the course of my class. They should never take anything I say for granted. Rather, they should take it only if they find meaning and value in it and are able to verify it. Empowering youth within traditional educational spaces involves destabilizing power relationships between teacher and student. If we think of our students as empty vessels that need to be filled with knowledge, we maintain a rigid power structure in our classes. We have all the knowledge and we'll pour out a little bit for them. In part, this results in disempowering students as we deny the authority of their own experiences and their own lives. The more compelling strategy might be to encourage students to decenter their own experience by trying to understand their own biases. For example, yesterday in one of my classes, we were discussing suicide and the presence of suicide in different religious traditions and ways different traditions have conceptualized it. For example, in the Jain tradition, suicide at end of life by fasting to death is the ultimate way of ending life, and is also one of the ways of reducing the karmic stain that you have on the world as you depart it. And one of my students said that that was monstrous, what she saw in this documentary. And so we unpacked it in the course of the class. We said, well, why did you feel that this is monstrous? Like, what about your relationship to suicide makes it seem that way for you? It turned out that she had suicide in her family, but also that she was brought up fairly strictly Roman Catholic. And so as a result, suicide would sort of not open up the access to heaven for you if you committed suicide. So that, for her, seeing that in another tradition was outrageous. So decentering the self is the first step. This allows them to have meaningful encounters and dialogues in the classroom as they stop trying to be representatives of Canada or Islam or Hinduism and rather learn to claim their personal pronoun and speak in terms of the I. When extended, an ethic of doubt ideally leads them to understand that they themselves are the result of complex negotiations and compromises, and that respect for others is a commitment to seeing them as similarly complex as oneself. This strategy refuses to let any one Christian speak for all Christians or Christianity in general, or one Canadian to speak for all of Canada. As a combination of doubt and understanding one's own subjectivity or one's own personal experience are key lessons of the humanities which help us resist facile arguments such as all Muslims are violent, or alternatively, equally problematic, all Muslims are peaceful. Multi-faith literacy cannot be merely construed as communicating concepts across faiths, but rather should lead us to a deeper understanding of the other. Deep understanding is more than merely spouting facts about a religious tradition such as the founder, the holy texts, but it's about qualitative engagement. The hallmark of multi-faith literacy is cultivating public spaces in which we can be critical of social ills such as sexism or homophobia or fundamentalism in a spirit of generosity without reducing those that disagree with us to an uncivilized other, or uncivilized or barbaric other. Failures of multi-faith literacy would include the moral panic that accompanied the proposal of Sharia tribunals in Ontario in the early 2000s. Although a governmental report believed the tribunals to be consistent with Canadian law and multiculturalism, a moral panic about Islam killed public conversation, and ultimately the proposal itself failed. I'm not arguing that Canadians cannot legitimately prohibit the expansion of law, which previously included Jews and Christians who were allowed to use these tribunals, but that the debate on the issue was not healthy. Rather, it was based on notions of Muslim patriarchy, female subordination, and backwardness. In addition to decentering subjective experiences in the classroom, another critical strategy which I use in my courses is teaching rather than avoiding contradiction. For example, how we reconcile the Muslim opprobrium for depicting the Prophet Muhammad with his image in a lot of Persianate illuminated manuscripts. Alternatively, how can we reconcile centuries of Muslim alcohol production and consumption with religious restrictions against intoxication? These examples serve as a critical point for dialogue and discussion and help us to frame religion as a distinctly complex human phenomena, and it is not something that is revealed in a perfected form, sort of with all the institutions attached. Islam, I frequently tell my students, has no opinions. You can't take it to dinner. You can't put it in a dress. The best you can do is talk to Muslims whose individual interpretations form the lifeblood of Islam. This is not an abdication of Islam to only individual interpretation, but rather strategic. For when religion is reduced to the realm of human interaction, we can avoid parochialism by creating common ground. A critical approach to religion is then not only looking at scriptural sources, but combining textualism with an interrogation of human behavior and contextualizing the ways that historical exigency should always complicate our understandings of the present. Being able to deconstruct authority is one of the most important ways that teachers can arm their students with critical minds. I see multi-faith literacy as centrally important to bolstering the rights and duties implied by multiculturalism. If we want multiculturalism to merely be static, as something that merely carves out space for multiple for multiple cultures, it's vulnerable of being used as a defense for unconscionable acts. If we conceive of multiculturalism as having an implied duty to engage and learn about the other, then multi-faith literacy may be a powerful tool for overcoming our nervousness about integrating Muslims or others into the Canadian milieu. I take the task of teaching critical approaches to religion through developing multi-faith literacy as an act of empowerment itself, teaching critical thinking as the most important single act of empowerment. By way of winding down or conclusion, allow me to revisit my initial statement that Canada is a pretty good place to be a Muslim. The lack of a single authoritative state-sanctioned brand of Islam allows Muslims considerable freedom in their religious affiliation and in their community building. Canadian Islam is not simply a shade of more vibrant versions imported from different countries. Rather, Canadian Islam is an evolving thing, which is shaped by the uniqueness of the Canadian context. Canadian Islam's story begins in the lost histories from the slave docks in Halifax, and it continues to be shaped by immigration and shifting patterns of integration. It is the ability of the religion to sustain multiple divergent voices that is the true hallmark of its arrival in Canada. And it's preserving its vibrancy demands that we not concede Islam to any one group or one person, but rather treat it as one facet of our very complicated selves. Thank you.